In the summer of 1947, a rancher stumbled upon a strange debris field on his property near Roswell, New Mexico. The debris consisted of rubber strips, tinfoil, metal, and thick paper. The rancher, Mac Brazel, reported his discovery to the sheriff's office, who then contacted the Roswell Army Airfield. Then, a press release stated that they had recovered a flying disc. The Roswell Army Airfield quickly retracted its statement, claiming that the debris was merely from a weather balloon. However, the initial press release had already sparked widespread speculation about what had crashed in Roswell. Over the years, numerous conspiracy theories have emerged, suggesting that the debris was from an alien spacecraft and that the government is covering up the truth. But not everything happened as we have been told in countless articles, documentaries, and TV shows. Most shockingly, a book released just a few years ago gives us a completely different version of the events. What the author was told by government insiders who handled the crashed wreckage and bodies recovered gives us a horrific side of the events, even scarier than the extraterrestrials. This is the Dark History Project. Please like and subscribe to know when new episodes are available. Now, let's get started. This is a topic that has been covered over the last few decades, and there are more than enough theories out there of what happened, what crashed, and who was involved. In all honesty, many of the theories are extremely hard to believe, and some just make no sense. What we do know is that the summer of 1947 was a strange year for the UAP or UFO phenomena. Just a month before the Roswell incident, another UFO incident put flying saucers on the map and made the term flying saucer mainstream. On June 24, 1947, Kenneth Arnold, a private pilot and businessman, was flying his small plane near Mount Rainier, Washington, when he claimed to have seen a string of 9 shiny, unidentified flying objects flying at incredible speeds. Arnold described the motion of the UFOs or UAPs as like a saucer if you skip it across water, leading to the popularization of the term flying saucer in association with UFOs. His estimate of the speed of these objects was approximately 1,200 miles per hour, significantly faster than any known aircraft at the time. The incident gained substantial media attention and was followed by a wave of similar sightings across the United States. Hundreds of flying saucers were reported to authorities following this event. Just a week after the Kenneth Arnold story went mainstream, on July 4, 1947, United Flight 105, a commercial flight, reported running into multiple flying saucers as they were flying over the Pacific Northwest. And 4 days later, on July 8, 1947, the Roswell Army Field issued a press release stating that they had recovered a flying disc. Before we go into the Roswell case, let's clear up a few things. This story is made up of way too many witnesses. I'm talking hundreds. On top of that, you have dozens of documentaries out there where many of the hosts seem to want to push narratives of cover-ups, connections to other cases, secret government agencies, reptilians, you name it. What we're going to try to do here is look at this story from the few people who were involved at the beginning, before the object disappeared into the secrecy archives of the US government. The Roswell Incident. Roswell was an interesting town for UFO activity during this time. There were sightings of UFOs in the area, many of which were reported to the sheriff's office. Most of these reports were dismissed since there were 2 major bases close by, and this is an important thing to understand before we go deep into the Roswell crash. One of the bases was the Roswell Army Airfield, located near Roswell. The Army Field was an important facility in the strategic network of the U.S. military. In 1947, this Army Field was home to the 509th Composite Group, which was the only unit in the world equipped with nuclear bombers at the time. This group gained fame for dropping atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki during World War II. The presence of such a high-profile unit underscored the strategic importance of the base in the post-war period. This is part of why many believe UFOs were monitoring this area, because of the nuclear bombs at the base. These sorts of reports not only happened in the United States, but also in Russia, another nuclear arm player at the time. Another close-by base, just a couple of hours west of Roswell, was Holloman Air Force Base, which was originally established during World War II as an Alamogordo bombing and gunnery range. In 1947, it was an active part of the United States Army Air Forces, which would later become the United States Air Force that same year. One of the key roles of Holloman AFB in the late 1940s was as a site for missile and rocket testing. The base was near the White Sands Proving Ground, now White Sands Missile Range, which was a major center for military and scientific rocketry. The proximity of these two facilities made the area a hub for cutting-edge aeronautical and missile research. An important side note that will later help us understand a new angle to the Roswell incident is that in 1946, quite a few German Nazi scientists arrived at Fort Bliss, right next to White Sands, about 127 to be precise. These scientists were part of the famous Operation Paperclip, which helped the United States bring as many German scientists as possible following World War II. Now, the Russians had a similar program, and there was quite a fight to take as many as possible. Both countries wanted the engineers behind the German war machine. Now, back to our story of the Roswell crash. What most people know is that a rancher found debris of some sort of aircraft scattered over his ranch. Then he brought the material he found into the sheriff's office, and the Roswell incident took a life of its own and became what it is today. What comes next might be a shock to some, but many believe the rancher, Mac Brazel, turned in the material he found on his ranch as soon as he found them. That's not how things happened. Most books, documentaries, and videos portray the story as if he found this great pile of extraterrestrial debris and told the authorities what he found. Brazel discovered the debris about 3 weeks before he took it to the sheriff's office on June 14th. He didn't think much of it at the time, so he moved the debris to pile it up in one place. One of the most controversial things I found in some of the books that account for the incident is that the rancher found materials similar to metal, thin foil, rubber, and wood beams. The reason why this is interesting is because a report released by the NSA titled The Roswell Incident in 1994 describes the weather balloons that were made out of rubber, some metal, and wood beams with a coating of Elmer's glue. Now, you may think this is a cover-up, and maybe. There are so many inconsistencies in government reports about the case. Obviously, what's weird here are the reports of finding wood, which is not mentioned in many of the documentaries and videos you find on the subject. You have to wonder if this is one of the reasons why he didn't report the incident right away. Maybe it was actually some experimental aircraft from another base. Most of the people who work at the Roswell Army Airfield had high clearances because of the type of work they do, but that doesn't mean it gives you access to any classified program. Any of our listeners who have been or are in the military or have worked for a defense contractor knows you might have high-level clearances, but only to what you are allowed to see and what you are working on. We're not dismissing the crashed object as extraterrestrial, but this is important to know. Another thing that is mentioned quite a bit when discussing the Roswell incident is the electrical storms in the area before the crash. But according to the National Weather Service, from April to August, there are severe thunderstorms in the area every year. So I'm not sure this is connected to what happened, but it could be something that attracts what crashed if it wasn't a military aircraft. Or it could be that the storms brought down a secret aircraft the Army was working on at the time. Back to Mac Brazel. A few days before the rancher reported the incident, the rancher was in a bar where he overheard some patrons talking about the flying saucer craze and heard some stories about these flying discs. After this event, he took some of the debris he found on his truck and took it into Sheriff George Wilcox's office and reported what he found. The sheriff then called the Roswell Army Airfield and informed them about what the rancher found. The case was then assigned to Major Jesse Marcel and Captain Sheridan Cavett. Later on, the rancher took them to the site to gather more of the material he found. Major Jesse Marcel took the debris to the commander of the Army Airfield, Colonel William Blanchard, who reported the finding to General Roger Ramey at Fort Worth Army Airfield. Something that is left out of many stories about Roswell is that when Blanchard reports the find to General Ramey, he tells him that they have pieces of a craft, possibly Russian. Remember this will come into play later. Some reports also mention that Blanchard dismissed it as being of Soviet origin, and that's one of the problems with this story. Which source has the truth, since most reports and interviews for this case are just based on eyewitness accounts and without government confirmation. Orders were then given to fly the material out to Fort Worth later that evening. By the end of the day, the Roswell Army Airfield officer Walter Haut issued the now famous press release that shocked the world, that the military had recovered a flying disc near Roswell.
Headline edition, July 8, 1947. The Army Air Forces has announced that a flying disc has been found and is now in the possession of the Army. Army officers say the missile, found sometime last week, has been inspected at Roswell, New Mexico, and sent to Wright Field, Ohio, for further inspection. Late this afternoon, a bulletin from New Mexico suggested that the widely publicized mystery of the flying saucers may soon be solved. Army Air Force officers reported that one of the strange discs had been found and inspected sometime last week. Our correspondents in Los Angeles and Chicago have been in contact with Army officials endeavoring to obtain all possible late information. Joe Wilson reports to us now from Chicago.
The Army may be getting to the bottom of all this talk about the so-called flying saucer. As a matter of fact, the 509th Atomic Bomb Group headquarters at Roswell, New Mexico, reports that it has received one of the discs which landed on a ranch outside Roswell. The disc landed at a ranch at Corona, New Mexico, and the rancher turned it over to the Air Force. Rancher W.W. Brizzell was the man who discovered the saucer. Colonel William Blanchard of the Roswell Air Base refuses to give details of what the flying disc looks like. In Fort Worth, Texas, where the object was first sent, Brigadier General Roger Ramey says that it is being shipped by air to the AAF Research Center at Wright Field, Ohio. A few moments ago, I talked to officials at Wright Field, and they declared that they expect the so-called flying saucer to be delivered there, but that it hasn't arrived as yet. In the meantime, General Ramey describes the object as being of flimsy construction, almost like a box kite. He says that it was so battered that he was unable to determine whether it had a disc form, and he does not indicate its size. Ramey says that so far as can be determined, no one saw the object in the air, and he describes it as being made of some sort of tinfoil. Other Army officials say that further information indicates that the object had a diameter of about 20 to 25 feet, and that nothing in the apparent construction indicated any capacity for speed, and that there was no evidence of a power plant. The disc also appeared too flimsy to carry a man. Now, back to Taylor Grant in New York.
There was important activity within the UN Security Council today.
Obviously, this announcement sent shockwaves around the world, sparking widespread interest and speculation about extraterrestrial life and flying saucers. Just a day after the initial press release, the U.S. Army Air Forces countered the RAAF's statement, claiming that the recovered object was not a flying saucer, but rather a weather balloon. One of the most interesting characters in this case, who is not mentioned too much, is Robert Porter, a Roswell Army Airfield flight engineer who was part of the crew in charge of loading the debris from the crash into a B-29. He described the size of the materials in a way that doesn't add up to being a flying saucer with beings inside. According to him, they loaded small packages into the plane, and most of them were the size of shoeboxes. He said the recovered material was extremely lightweight, and he mentioned most of the items could have fit in the trunk of a car. Then, on July 8th, Major Jesse Marcel gave a press conference in Fort Worth showcasing fragments of a weather balloon. This was intended to dispel burgeoning UFO theories. However, this reversal sparked controversy and suspicion, leading many to believe in a government cover-up. This press release became a pivotal moment in UFO lore, fueling ongoing debates and conspiracy theories about the Roswell incident. There are a couple of things to go over at the famous press conference. First, many believe that the debris shown was not what was found at the crash site. Now, this is in direct contradiction with someone else who was present. Colonel Thomas Dubose, who was present at the time the incident happened and during the press conference, said later in his life the debris material presented at the press conference was the same one as the one in Roswell. He denied that it was stitched in the process. Note that this comes in direct contradiction with what Major Jesse Marcel mentioned later in his life about what happened. But there's a twist in this part of the story. With the photos taken during the press conference, General Roger Ramey had a document in his hand. Decades later, thanks to known nuclear physicist and UFO researcher Stanton Friedman, we now know some of the words that were in this document, which include victims of the wreck, disk, new find, and ship 2, assuring that teams should misstate the meaning of the story. After the material was in Fort Worth, there were many issues with the chain of custody. There are many theories of what happened, from how it went to Hangar 18 and Wright-Patterson to Area 51, which didn't even exist at the time, or to Los Alamos National Labs. The exact whereabouts and handling of the debris within Fort Worth remain unclear to this day. Some accounts suggest it was further examined and stored at the base, while others claim it was quickly disposed of. To me, this is where the story of what happened in those days ends. I say this because if we look at what happened during those days, that's all we find. Something extremely important to understand about the Roswell incident is that many of the theories we now know about, including the alien bodies and the mysterious materials the ship was made out of, didn't come into mainstream until almost 30 years later. The story really dies from 1947 and doesn't come back to life until 1978. In 78, the nuclear physicist Stanton Friedman spoke to Jesse Marcel, where he explained how the whole thing was a cover story. Soon after the interview, other media platforms spoke to Marcel and renewed interest in the story, launching a series of TV shows, books, new theories, and new witnesses. Keep in mind, this happened 30 years after the actual incident. It's important to note that some of the books that came out were written by authors who previously wrote about the Bermuda Triangle, Atlantis, and other popular conspiracy theories. Not saying these stories are not true, but these subjects are just hard to prove. The stories about alien bodies being recovered were not as popular until the early 1980s. As mentioned before, the only place where we found someone talking about bodies or victims was from the paper General Ramey had in his hands and during the famous press release. But we didn't know what the paper was until decades later, and we only know some of the words that were readable after careful study of the negatives. One of the other stories that made the belief that alien bodies were recovered was due to an interview with a local mortician called Glenn Dennis. The mortician claims that he got a call from the Roswell Army Airfield and was asked to provide child-sized caskets. He later claimed, and I mean about 40 years after the incident, that a friend of his who was a nurse at the base saw an alien autopsy from the bodies recovered from the crash. He was interviewed by several media outlets, was in countless documentaries, and even co-founded the UFO Museum in Roswell, along with a former Roswell Army Airfield officer who tells the same story. Some prominent UFO researchers do not believe this story and claim that Glenn Dennis did it for fame, or question why he kept it a secret for over 40 years and didn't talk about it until the Roswell case went mainstream in the 1980s. And there's no proof about the so-called nurse friend who witnessed the alien autopsy. It's like this friend doesn't exist, and this assessment has been shared by UFO researchers as well who doubt Glenn Dennis's version of events. With that said, there might be some truth to what he said, especially when he talks about how he was asked to provide child-sized caskets. If the terrifying story we are going to talk about next is true, Glenn Dennis might have told the truth, but may have exaggerated his side of the events just so it sounds more controversial. A new perspective on the Roswell crash. There's a very controversial book that covers Area 51 and the projects that have been developed and tested at the base. The book is called Area 51, An Uncensored History of America's Top Secret Military Base by Annie Jacobson. The reason why I say the book is controversial is because it doesn't satisfy the UFO believers or the deniers. The believers who think that there's actual alien aircraft in the test site being hidden from the public criticize the book for not covering that subject well enough. That wasn't the purpose of the book. The purpose was to look at the beginnings of the base and why it was established along with many amazing advances in technology developed and tested there. One of the stories that Annie Jacobson covered more on the conspiracy side has to do with the Roswell crash of 1947. But it's not what you think. To give you a brief summary, one of her sources, who seems to be a very reliable source, someone who was a key figure in both the Manhattan Project and Area 51 project, this person relates what he says really happened in Roswell, eventually saying some of the pieces of wreckage and bodies were taken to Area 51. To validate who the source is, Annie spoke to many of the engineers, technicians, and people from both the government and the companies that were doing the work, designing of these new weapon systems back then. And many of her sources referred her to this one person, who was one of the top lead engineers in many of those projects. On to Roswell. The source said that what crashed in Roswell was not aliens. It was a Soviet propaganda program to disseminate fear among the American population. Straight psychological warfare. Keep in mind that after World War II, most of the European countries were left devastated economically. How was Russia going to fight the new war that was brewing with the Americans without that much economic power? Propaganda is a powerful tool that can significantly influence the outcome of conflicts, including wars, without resorting to physical fighting. It operates by shaping perceptions, controlling narratives, and manipulating public opinion to achieve strategic objectives. Just a few weeks ago, Netflix released a movie called Leave the World Behind. If you haven't seen it, spoiler alert. Pretty much, we have an attack in the US which seems to start with a cyber attack that then they imply cities are being bombed. At one point in the movie, there are propaganda flyers on both the East Coast and West Coast contradicting each other in regard to who the attacker is. At some point, one of the main characters says this is a 3-stage attack to topple a government from within. The first step is disabling communication and transportation. Second, chaos through attacks and misinformation. And third, people turn on each other and a coup d'etat takes place. This is a way of warfare that's pretty low on cost. Back in the 1940s, the Soviet misinformation would have been a cheap way to attack the United States. Just think of the amount of misinformation in the last few elections. Now, what the book implies is that the Soviets entered American airspace and dropped an aircraft in Roswell that was made to look like it was out of this world. If that was the case and it was successful, think of the embarrassment that the Russians were able to get inside American airspace without the Americans knowing, and very close to some sensitive sites. Remember, Los Alamos National Labs is not too far from Roswell, and Roswell holds the Roswell Army Airfield, where pilots were trained to drop atomic bombs. This would have been a good enough reason for the Army to keep everything under wraps. I mean, think of what the US population would have thought if the Soviets were able to get in so close to military sites. According to this source, they did recover an aircraft and bodies. But the bodies were not aliens, but actually handicapped children surgically changed to look like aliens at first glance. Think about it. Who would do something like that just to push your propaganda campaign? How did Stalin sign off on this project? It is just sickening that leaders are willing to go this far for power when they don't even care about innocent lives from their side. And this sides with the Roswell mortician who said he was asked for children-sized caskets. Regarding the aircraft, going back to Operation Paperclip, the controversial operation after World War II to bring as many Nazi scientists and engineers as possible into the US to bring their knowledge and to allow the US to get ahead of the Russians in military technology. As mentioned before, the Russians had their own Project Paperclip, trying to grab as many high-level Nazi scientists and engineers as possible for the same purpose. They were actively looking for two brothers, the Horten brothers. These two guys were in the Luftwaffe, designing airplanes that looked like spacecraft. If you look at the design of the Horten 229, something that was designed in the early 1940s, it looks very similar to the modern B-2 bomber, and it looks like something out of this world. This craft was the first one to implement stealth-like technology. After the war, the aircraft was shipped to the US to be studied, and it currently sits at the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C. In the late 1940s, personnel of the US Air Force seriously considered that UFOs were actually secret aircraft by the Soviets based on their designs. Some of the eyewitness accounts about what happened in Roswell are really interesting. There are claims that the Nazi scientists held at Fort Bliss at the time were shown the craft from Roswell, and their immediate reaction was asking if that was one of the Horten brothers' aircraft. After the war, the US made serious efforts to pursue and capture them. They not only designed the first flying wing, but some aircraft that literally looked like flying saucers. Whatever happened after they were identified in South America is still classified to this day. Who knows what the US government did or what type of information they got from those guys? Did they help the Russians to create the Roswell incident and create chaos in the United States? If this is true, that what crashed in Roswell was a Soviet craft designed to create chaos and confusion, it's hard to say if the Horten brothers were the ones to help the Soviets do this. Or was it other Russian engineers who used their designs and knew about the Hortens' flying wings? There's not much evidence to support that they worked with the Soviets after the war. But not sure if this is by design or if it just didn't happen. The US government also tried to hide that they brought over German scientists and engineers after the war. Just imagine, what would the population think, both in Russia and here in the US, that your government protected, hired, and had German scientists on the payroll after the war? Remember, some of these scientists were involved in terrible atrocities committed during the war. There are some anecdotes about how federal agents were transporting these German scientists across the country to Fort Bliss, and they told them not to speak to anyone, even if they knew English, since people would get extremely upset if they knew the government was protecting them. The theory that the Roswell incident involved a Soviet crash is one of the many surrounding the mysterious event. While it provides an interesting Cold War-era context to the incident, the lack of solid evidence and the speculative nature of the claims means it remains just one of several theories. Just like many of the stories and theories we have heard in the last 40-plus years, it is all based on eyewitness accounts, and hard to know which ones are real. I do want to believe a lot of them, but you always run into some conflict with all the different versions. I think after almost 80 years, it's going to take a lot for us to know what really happened out there, even if the government comes out with some kind of proof of what happened. In the 1990s, the US Air Force released several reports about what happened. Funny thing is, one released in 1994 contradicted the one released in 1997. One report said it was Project Mogul, which were high-altitude craft designed to detect sound waves generated by Soviet atomic bomb tests using high-altitude balloons carrying sensitive equipment. Then, the 1997 report, titled the Roswell Report Case Closed. This report addressed claims of alien bodies being recovered at the crash site. It explained that these accounts were likely misidentifications of anthropomorphic dummies used in high-altitude parachute tests conducted in the 1950s, under projects such as Operation High Dive. The obvious issue is that the Roswell crash was in 1947 and Operation High Dive was in the 1950s. And on top of that, what happened to their explanation that this was a high-altitude balloon to spy on the Soviets? The US government's explanations for the Roswell incident have shifted over time. This is why I think that even if they release the truth, most people are going to be skeptical. After nearly 80 years, there are plenty of stories and theories to pick and choose from. People are going to gravitate and are going to cherry-pick the ones that they like the most. The delayed and evolving nature of these explanations has contributed significantly to the enduring mystery and widespread speculation surrounding the event. Whether due to genuine national security concerns or other reasons, the initial lack of transparency set the stage for one of the most enduring and iconic UFO incidents in history. Thank you for being with us for this episode of the Dark History Project. Please help us out by sharing, subscribing, or liking this episode. If the platform you're listening to allows for comments, let us know what you think. We're available on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcast, and everywhere else you can listen to podcasts. We hope you enjoyed it, and our next episode will come out soon about the events that unleashed World War I. See you then.